Revolutionary culture. Although the French Revolution ended with Napoleon's coup of 18 Brumaire, the events of this volatile decade exerted an enormous influence over the subsequent history of Europe and the world. During the Napoleonic era, political movements around Europe drew on elements of the revolutionary legacy, agitating for democratic institutions, the mobilization of the nation, and the abolition of traditional social and legal hierarchies. At home, France would experience new revolutions in 1830, 1848, and in the Paris Commune of 1870 to 1871, each of which adopted much of the symbolism and rhetoric first created between 1789 and 1794. Indeed, such was the stubborn persistence of the revolutionary legacy that one prominent French historian began a polemic published nearly 2 centuries after 1789 by insisting the revolution is over. During the 20th century, French revolutionary ideals influenced communist movements in Russia, China, and elsewhere, as well as national independence movements in Africa and Asia. Any attempt to evaluate the significance of the French Revolution must balance the extent to which it represented a radical historical rupture against the extent to which it continued long-term developments. Throughout much of Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, dynastic states were fielding larger armies as well as developing more centralized and rationalized administrative apparatuses. Moreover, the fabric of feudalism had been eroding for hundreds of years before the outbreak of the Revolution. In most of Western Europe, the aristocracy had lost much of its traditional authority by the late 18th century, and social status was increasingly associated with economic class rather than with hereditary hierarchies. In political terms, a series of revolutionary movements, including the English Revolution of the 17th century, the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783, and the Dutch Revolt of the 1780s, had challenged monarchical authority elsewhere in the Atlantic world. In all these ways, the French Revolution may be seen as consolidating and reinforcing long-standing trends rather than as changing the direction of history. The profoundly new dimension of the French Revolution was something less tangible or quantifiable. It was rooted in the realm of political imagination. Though the world had witnessed innumerable social and political revolts before, none of these previous movements had matched the ambitions of 1789. The leaders of the French Revolution shared a political credo founded on 2 premises. First, they held that human society could and should be organized according to purely rational principles, and thus that the authority of reason should always take precedence over that of tradition. Second, they believed that the path to this new rational order was through mass political activism, that the will of the people would lead the way to utopia. The combination of these 2 premises laid the foundation for a potent and volatile new form of politics that would inspire activists far beyond the borders of France. Mobilization of the masses. In What is the Third Estate, the Abbé Sieyès had defined the power of the French people in nearly mythical terms. The nation is prior to everything. It is the source of everything. Its will is always legal. Indeed, it is the law itself. This bold claim marked a crucial difference between the French Revolution and previous mass political movements, such as the American War of Independence. In France, popular political activism came to be interpreted through a more radical symbolic frame than had been the case with earlier movements, a development that in turn contributed to more extreme forms of political action. The radicalization of the symbolic frame of popular politics was evident from the first months of the Revolution. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789, for example, was an event of little immediate practical significance. The fall of the fortress yielded few arms and only a handful of prisoners to its conquerors. Yet the symbolic import of this event was immeasurable. Pre-revolutionary journalists, such as the flamboyant Simon Linguet, 1736 to 1794, had depicted the Bastille as a dark bastion of despotism. Contemporary chroniclers thus celebrated its destruction as a triumph in the struggle for the liberation of the French people. Even more important, Louis XVI himself interpreted the fall of the Bastille as an expression of the people's will. Fearing that his soldiers might refuse his commands, he abandoned the notion of dispersing the National Assembly by force, allowing the revolution to gain momentum at a critical historical moment and rendering future resistance against popular radicalism more difficult. During the Great Fear of July in August 1789, the emergence of a new political symbolism likewise contributed to the radicalization of events. This wave of violence began as a relatively traditional form of rural unrest, such as had often occurred in the French countryside during times of famine. After news spread of the fall of the Bastille, however, peasants around France suddenly turned their wrath against aristocrats whom they thought had hatched a famine plot to starve the people. The National Assembly's response to these events was even more extreme. On August 4th, it capitulated to what the delegates viewed as the will of the people by abolishing virtually all remnants of the feudal order. In both of these early revolutionary events, the effectiveness of mass political activism stemmed partly from the fact that the government authorities, as well as the protesters, interpreted the crowds' actions as manifestations of an infallible and inexorable national will. By identifying the people as the sole source of legitimate political authority, Sieyès and other revolutionary leaders not merely justified but demanded the participation of the masses in political life. This activist fervor was captured most powerfully in the lyrics of La Marseillaise, the anthem composed by a young army engineer in Strasbourg in April 1792 on the eve of the first battle of the Revolutionary Wars. Hautes armes, citoyens, echoes the chorus. The nation's enemies have raised the bloody banner against the enfants de la patrie, the children of the fatherland. The citizenry must rise up and water the fields with the impure blood of tyrants in order to rescue France from its foes. As the revolution turned increasingly radical, the desire to involve the people in politics escalated. Yet the doctrine of absolute national sovereignty posed two difficult dilemmas. First, how could a unified expression of the national will be found in a country of nearly 30 million people? Second, how could revolutionary leaders mobilize mass support while still controlling the course of events by preventing spontaneous challenges to their political authority from below? Throughout the period 1789 to 1799, popular political activism demonstrated the capacity to topple as well as to support ruling elites. One highly visible way in which the masses were mobilized was through revolutionary festivals manifesting the patriotism of unity of the nation. Some of the first of these festivals appear to have been organized without careful orchestration from above. In November 1789, for example, 12,000 National Guardsmen from southeast France convened on the banks of the Rhone River, swearing to uphold constitutional liberty in the presence of heaven on their hearts and on their arms. Over the following months, more elaborately choreographed ceremonies were held in various provincial cities. On July 14, 1790, 50,000 National Guardsmen and 400,000 spectators gathered in a torrential rainstorm on the Champs de Mars, a parade ground in Paris to celebrate the Festival of the Federation. The organizers of the festival included Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the wily former Bishop of Autun, who celebrated a mass and benediction, and Lafayette, who led the assembled guards in an oath of allegiance to the Trinity of the nation, the law, the king. King Louis XVI, wielding a pickaxe at the Champ de Mars, preparing the ground for the Festival of Federation, 1790. Frontispiece, to Révolution de France à de Bourbon, number 36. Many of the revolutionary festivals inspired a genuine outpouring of an utopian spirit among the participants. In July 1790, thousands of Parisians of all classes joined in preparing the grounds for the Festival of the Federation. According to a contemporary illustration, even the king helped in the digging. Yet the festivals also contained an uneasy mix of symbolic elements. These spectacles were simultaneously manifestations of the revolution, physically depicting the nation as a unified communal body, and also often conservative pageants that aimed to stabilize the political order by portraying the revolution as a completed work. Moreover, the festival's joyful celebration of national harmony coincided with a dark undercurrent of violence. The first festival of the Federation in Paris commemorated the storming of the Bastille. Subsequent revolutionary festivals established by 1794 paid homage to other pivotal moments of revolutionary violence: the attack on the Tuileries of August 10, 1792, the execution of the king on January 21, 1793, and the insurrection of May 31, 1793, that led to the arrest of the Girondins in the Convention. The Festival of the Supreme Being, presided over by Robespierre, drawing by Naudet. At the top of the hill stands the Tree of Liberty. Adjacent to the hill on a high pedestal is the statue of Hercules. A further celebration, initiated on 20 Prairial, June 8, 1794, in the Tuileries Gardens, was the Festival of the Supreme Being, which Robespierre intended to inaugurate a new civic religion in place of Catholicism. Robespierre's speech reflected the darkening tone of the revolution. After exalting the Supreme Being and the heroic spirit of the Republic, he denounced this monster which the spirit of kings had spewed forth over France, and declared, "Frenchmen, Republicans, it is up to you to purify the earth which they, tyrants, have defiled, and to restore the justice they have banished from it. Liberty and virtue issue together from the breast of the divinity. One cannot reside among men without the other." He then proceeded to demonstrate allegorically the triumph of wisdom by setting fire to figures of atheism, vice, and folly. From the ruins emerged a statue of wisdom triumphant. Revolutionary festivals were but one means of conveying the solidarity of the French nation. In 1793, the artist Jacques Louis David proposed to erect a gargantuan statue of Hercules on the Pont Neuf. And throughout the Terror, the image of Hercules appeared regularly in speeches by revolutionary orators, in engravings, and on the seal of the convention. This virile giant was a male counterpart to Marion, the female icon of liberty, who also frequently appeared as a visual representation of the revolution. Another revolutionary icon was the Liberty Tree, symbolizing the rebirth of the nation, festooned with slogans and tricolor ribbons and topped by the red Phrygian cap that had been worn by slaves in the Roman Empire. The Liberty trees were inspired by maypoles erected by peasants in Périgord during a revolt of 1790. By May 1792, 60,000 Liberty trees had been planted in public squares and village greens around France. Such revolutionary symbols had a profound practical impact on everyday life in France. By planting a Liberty tree, the residents of a village announced their rejection of traditional authority and their loyalty to the new order. Thus, the Liberty trees became a center of symbolic warfare. They were frequently uprooted or vandalized by opponents of the revolution. Clothing became another powerful marker of political allegiances. After July 5, 1792, all men in France were obligated to wear the tricolor cockade, and with the notable exception of Robespierre, virtually all patriotic Jacobin men came to wear the trousers of the sans culottes. Many women dressed in flowing white robes like those worn by men of the Roman Republic. Both sexes rejected the wigs and powdered hair of the old regime in favor of simple and unaffected hairstyles. During the Thermidorian era, by contrast, men and women rapidly returned to more revealing and flamboyant clothing. Likewise, after 1794, the French once again began to indulge in the pleasures that had been banned during the Terror. Theaters, cafes, and ballrooms flourished in the freer atmosphere. No aspect of revolutionary political mobilization had more potent or lasting significance than the military revolution exemplified by the levy in Marseille. Though the size of European armies had been increasing steadily since the early 16th century, the French Revolution resulted in a massive escalation in the scale and objectives of military activity. In 1788 to 1789, before the outbreak of the Revolution, the Royal Army had 150,000 soldiers. By August 1793, on the eve of the levy in Marseille, the official size of the army had climbed to 645,000 men, though many of these lacked uniforms, weapons, and training. By September 1794, the Army of the Republic numbered 1,169,000 soldiers. Although probably only about 730,000 of these were in active service, this was still nearly twice as many soldiers as had been fielded by any previous European army. Not only did the levy in Marseille increase the sheer size of the French army, it also transformed the nature of warfare. By placing all French citizens in permanent requisition for army service, this decree inaugurated the era of total war in which nations dedicated all of their resources to the destruction of their enemies. The army laid claim to the entire economic product of France and asserted the right to draft any adult male for military service, though initially it targeted only unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25. Each battalion was to carry into battle a banner with the inscription, "The French people risen against tyrants." Unlike previous armies constituted of mercenaries and unwilling conscripts, this new military force would be motivated by undying devotion to the glory of the fatherland. The Army of the Republic had mixed success in recruiting citizen soldiers. The levy in Marseille met with strong resistance in rural France, where peasants thought much more in terms of local or regional identities than in terms of allegiance to an abstract nation. Many young men sought to evade military service, others deserted the army. Nonetheless, ideology played a profound role in intensifying the martial spirit of French soldiers and in inspiring the spectacular successes of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic armies. In the words of the Prussian observer Karl von Clausewitz, the revolution gave rise to a force that beggared all imagination. Suddenly war again became the business of the people, a people of 30 millions, all of whom considered themselves to be citizens. Instead of governments and armies as heretofore, the full weight of the nation was thrown into the balance. The resources and efforts now available for use surpassed all conventional limits. Nothing now impeded the vigor with which war could be waged. The cult of reason. For the English Whig Edmund Burke, the principal error of the French revolutionaries stemmed from their blind faith in the powers of human rationality. When ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, the loss cannot possibly be estimated. From that moment we have no compass to govern us, nor can we know distinctly to what port we steer. Although he had been an avid supporter of the American Revolution, Burke was an early and caustic critic of the Revolution in France. In a treatise published in 1790, when many European intellectuals were still intoxicated by the glow of the revolutionaries' early triumphs, Burke anticipated a darker side to the principles articulated in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. On this scheme of things, a king is but a man, a queen is but a woman is but an animal not of the highest order. All homage paid to the sex in general as such, and without distinct views, is to be regarded as romance and folly. Regicide and parricide and sacrilege are but fictions of superstition, corrupting jurisprudence by destroying its simplicity. The murder of a king or a queen or a bishop or a father are only common homicide, and if the people are by any chance or in any way gainers by it, a sort of homicide much the most pardonable, and into which we ought not to make too severe a scrutiny. As Burke detected, perhaps the most potent dimension of the French revolutionaries' rhetoric was the claim that they had rendered history irrelevant. The American War of Independence had been motivated, in its initial stages, by the desire to restore the traditional rights of Englishmen, such as the right to representation in apportioning taxes. In France, by contrast, the more radical revolutionaries argued for starting from first principles, constructing a new world on the ashes of the old. This rationalizing impulse manifested itself from the initial months of the Revolution, for example, with the abolition of feudal dues and the administrative reorganization of France into départements. It continued through the 1790s. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, the army was accompanied by a legion of scientists who brought back to France artifacts such as the Rosetta Stone. Some of the effects of revolutionary rationalization were long-lasting. In 1790, the National Assembly commissioned the French Academy of Sciences to develop the new standardized system of weights and measures to replace the bewildering array of such systems that had existed under the old regime. The product of this work, carried out by Joseph Louis Lagrange, was the metric system, which was based on a unit of length, the meter, and a unit of mass, the gram. Initially, the meter was defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator, though this definition was subsequently modified because of the practical difficulties involved in surveying this distance accurately. The gram was defined as the mass of water that would fill a cube whose sides each measured 0.01 meters. The metric system was formally established in France in December 1799, shortly after Napoleon's coup, and it has since been adopted throughout most of the industrialized world. Other rationalizing efforts, such as the revolutionary calendar, proved more transitory. This calendar, established by the National Convention in October 1793, began the year 1 with the founding of the Republic on September 22, 1792. It divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, all of which were named after the seasons. Vendemiaire, vintage, Brumaire, fog, Frimaire, frost, Nivos, snow, Pluvios, rain, Ventos, wind, Germinal, buds, Florio, flowers, Prairial, meadow, Messidor, harvest, Thermidor, heat, and Fructidor, fruit. The remaining 5 days were devoted to an autumn festival celebrating the creation of the Republic. Although the revolutionary calendar remained in place until January 1806, it inspired little love from the citizens of France. Because each month consisted of 3 weeks, which were 10 days long, the weekend was reduced to 1 day in 10. By eliminating Sunday, the calendar was also antithetical to Christian worship. Moreover, since the rest of Western Europe already possessed the standardized calendar, the new way of measuring time created more confusion than clarity. For the same reason, other revolutionary innovations, such as the decimal clock, which divided the day into 10 hours of 100 minutes of 100 seconds, proved impractical. This tendency to value the authority of reason over that of tradition had profound implications for the evolution of European politics. By expressing such strong faith in the possibility of ordering the world rationally, the revolutionaries established a virtually boundless vision of the capacities of political action. Their principles justified the annihilation of any system of authority that was perceived as oppressive or unreasonable. Thus, in the aftermath of 1789, the rhetoric of the French revolutionaries was adopted and transformed by numerous groups that sought to combat other forms of oppression, for example, that based on gender, race, or economic class. The rights of women and ethnic minorities. The revolutionaries' faith in rational universal principles was tempered by their desire to prevent the breakdown of social order, which they feared might ensue if these principles were extended to their logical conclusions. This internal conflict manifested itself in debates over women's rights, the abolition of slavery, and the status of religious minorities. Women played a central role in some of the early events of the French Revolution, such as the March on Versailles of October 1789, which brought the royal family back to Paris. During the first month of the Revolution, a few political activists called for the extension of the full rights of citizenship to women as well as men. In July 1790, the Marquis de Condorcet, 1743 to 1794, one of the leading intellectuals of the Enlightenment, argued that women should be granted the right to vote. The French revolutionaries, he contended, had violated the principle of equality of rights by quietly depriving half of mankind from the rights of citizenship. During 1790 and 1791, a small group called the Cercle Social Circle, campaigned vocally for women's rights. A prominent figure in this movement was the Dutch woman Etta Palm de Eders, who compared the despotism of husbands to that of absolute monarchs. In a speech to a political club in December 1790, she declared, "The prejudices with which our sex has been surrounded have changed what was for us the sweetest and most saintly of duties, those of wife and mother, into a painful and terrible slavery." Despite these calls for female emancipation, the National Assembly gave no serious consideration to granting women political rights in the Constitution of 1791. The delegate Talleyrand spoke for the majority of his colleagues when he declared that it was against the wishes of nature for women to participate in political life and that the common happiness required harmony in the division of powers between the sexes. In this matter, as in many others, the rhetoric of the French revolutionaries reflected the influence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Already in the dedication to his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, 1755, Rousseau had contrasted the modest graces of the amiable and virtuous daughters of Geneva, his idolized native city, with the puerile and loose women of other cities. Unlike these other women who corrupted public morals and corroded liberty, the Genevan women exercised their chaste influence only within the limits of conjugal union, this ensuring political harmony and domestic tranquility. In this passage, as in his subsequent novel, Les Nouvelles Héloïses, and his educational treatise, Émile, Rousseau anticipated 19th century ideals of domesticity, which drew a sharp division between the male, public, and female, private spheres of society. During the Revolution, Rousseau's ideals were invoked to vilify Marie Antoinette as a bad mother and unfaithful wife whose conduct damaged not only her family, but also the nation as a whole. Across the Channel in Britain, the novelist and political pamphleteer Marie Wollstonecraft took the dismissive attitude toward women's rights exhibited by Rousseau, Talleyrand, and others as a challenge. She responded with an extended treatise entitled A Vindication of Rights of Women, which was published in 1792. Wollstonecraft observed that the perpetual subjection of women to male authority had made it impossible for them to develop fully their natural talents. Because women were forced to focus their energies on pleasing men, they were unable to cultivate their own virtue and rational faculties. Women, she argued, must be educated for independence, not for dependence. Their emancipation would make them more affectionate wives and mothers, and it would better enable them to raise their children as virtuous citizens. In France, the playwright Marie Gouze, who wrote under the name Olympe de Gouges, crafted a pointed response to the revolutionary constitution's exclusion of women from active citizenship. Her Declaration of the Rights of Women, composed in September 1791, appropriated the language of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Article 1 of her declaration began, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." In Article 2, she declared, "The purpose of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of women and man." Gouges not only broadened the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen to include women, but also extended the nature of these rights to the sphere of social relations. She recognized that without property rights and the right of divorce, for example, political rights for women would have little value. In 1793, France's Jacobin leaders sent her to the guillotine, both because of her counter-revolutionary Girondin views and because they labeled her an unnatural woman. During the debates of 1793 over the new Republican Constitution, a few delegates to the National Convention revisited the question of whether women should be granted border rights, but there was little support for these proposals. In October 1793, the convention passed a decree banning women's political societies. The Jacobin delegate Jean-Baptiste Amar, who introduced this proposal in the Assembly, argued that women were hardly capable of lofty conceptions and serious cogitations, and that they were destined by nature to perform private functions rather than to participate in public life. 3 weeks later, when a group of women wearing red caps arrived at the Paris City Hall, the radical leader Pierre Gaspard Chaumette denounced them heatedly. "It is shocking, it is contrary to all the laws of nature for a woman to want to make herself a man." Since when is it permitted to renounce one's sex? Since when it is decent to see women abandon the pious cares of their household, the cradle of their children, to come into public places, to the galleries to hear speeches, to the bar of the Senate? In the sphere of social relations, the French Revolution also had mixed effects on women's rights. In September 1792, the Legislative Assembly legalized divorce on the logic that an absolute prohibition of divorce represented an infringement on the liberty of French citizens. Initially, the terms for divorce were defined liberally. Any of 7 grounds, including incompatibility and mutual consent, could be invoked to justify the dissolution of a marriage. Over the subsequent decade, about 30,000 divorces were granted in France, of which approximately 70% were initiated by women. This easy access to divorce, and the fact that women availed themselves of this option more frequently than men, provoked intense opposition from Catholics and political conservatives. In 1797, the legislature of the Directory rewrote the divorce law to impose a 6-month waiting period for divorces justified on the basis of incompatibility. The Napoleonic Code, adopted in 1804, was more conservative, yet in terms of women's legal position, severely restricting the right of divorce, as well as women's rights of property ownership, and formally subordinating women to the legal authority of their husbands. The history of revolutionary divorce law had a striking parallel in the legislation over the status of illegitimate children. In November 1793, the Convention passed a decree establishing the principle, in accordance with the revolutionary ideal of universal equality, that children born out of wedlock should have the same rights of inheritance as those of other children. Yet this well-meaning statement of principle ultimately had disastrous effects for the law's intended beneficiaries. To begin with, the authors of the legislation felt compelled to limit the inheritance rights of children of adulterous liaisons as compared with the children of 2 unwed parents. They did not even dare mention the case of offspring of incestuous relationships. By 1795, fearing the potentially corrosive effects of the legislation on the sanctity of the family, the government of the Directory severely restricted the inheritance rights of illegitimate children. For example, it denied them the ability to establish paternity unless the father freely admitted it. Married men had already been prohibited from voluntarily acknowledging paternity of any illegitimate children. Ultimately, under the Napoleonic Code, illegitimate children were assigned a legal status even more disadvantageous than had existed under the old regime. On balance, the revolution had mixed effects on gender relations. On the one hand, it provided a new political language that had the potential to justify a radical reordering of the domestic sphere. The Rhetoric of the Rights of Man established a framework within which women could assert claims to freedom and equality, disputing the traditional biblical authority for husbands' right to rule over their wives. On the other hand, the turmoil of the revolutionary events also provoked a powerful conservative reaction within France, which sought to preserve domestic tranquility by returning women to the home. Many of the most ardent male revolutionary activists were highly resistant to women's participation in public life. In a sense, women paid the price for the liberation of men, as France's political leaders sought to assure the citizenry that the adoption of revolutionary principles would not produce chaos in the private sphere and the overthrow of all existing order. The institution of slavery in the French colonies, especially on the highly lucrative sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue, created another potent dilemma for revolutionary politicians. During the early months of the Revolution, an organization called the Society of the Friends of Blacks, which Condorcet had helped establish in 1788, demanded an end to the slave trade and the gradual abolition of slavery. Yet most of the revolutionary leaders initially resisted this course of action, fearing the loss of French commercial wealth and colonial power. Moreover, the colonial plantation owners exercised considerable influence over a number of delegates to the National Assembly, and they strenuously opposed any steps toward emancipation. Between 1789 and 1791, however, the white planters of Saint-Domingue faced increasingly sharp challenges to their authority. Already in October 1789, the royal governor of the colony asserted that the blacks all share an idea that struck them spontaneously, that the white slaves killed their masters and now free they govern themselves and regain possession of the land. Were the black slaves of Saint-Domingue to follow the example of the white slaves of France, he feared, the island could be awash in blood. Political tensions in the colony were heightened by its complex racial composition. Alongside 465,000 black slaves, Saint-Domingue was populated by 30,000 whites and 27,000 free blacks and mulattoes. Although the majority of slave owners were white, about 1/4 of the slaves in the colony were owned by free blacks. When news reached Saint-Domingue of the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, the white planters sent delegates to France to serve as delegates in the new National Assembly. Following the example of the whites, the free mulattoes likewise appointed delegates and demanded that they be represented too. The delegates of the white planters sought to prevent the mulattoes from being seated in the National Assembly, fearing that this would destabilize race relations in the colony. Both the whites and the mulattoes opposed the extension of rights to free blacks or slaves. Confronted by these conflicting demands, the National Assembly initially denied political rights to free blacks and mulattoes and threatened to prosecute anyone who promoted rebellion among the slaves. Yet, in May 1791, the Assembly softened its resistance, granting political rights to all free blacks whose parents had also been free, a tiny fraction of the overall group. 3 months later, in August 1791, a slave revolt erupted in Saint-Domingue, and when the National Assembly responded by revoking the rights of free blacks, they too took up arms against the island's white rulers. The rebels' chief military strategist was Jean-François Toussaint Louverture, circa 1744 to 1803, a self-educated slave who had obtained his freedom shortly before the outbreak of the revolt. He was dubbed Louverture, the opening for a series of lightning campaigns he led in 1793 when he struck a brief alliance with the Spaniards on the island. Alarmed at the threat of a joint British and Spanish invasion supported by the rebel slaves, 2 French commissioners in Saint-Domingue decided to abolish slavery in the colony in the fall of 1795. Toussaint Louverture reciprocated by leading a campaign against the British and Spanish occupying forces on the eastern part of the island. On February 4, 1794, the National Convention formally abolished slavery throughout the French colonies. Unfortunately, the convention's proclamation did little to resolve the racial conflicts in Saint-Domingue. Many white planters simply ignored the new law or transformed slavery into compulsory labor. The Emancipation Decree was also opposed by the slave owners among the free blacks and mulattoes. The turmoil on the island continued into the Napoleonic era, culminating in 1804 with the victory of the former slaves and the establishment of an independent republic, which was named Haiti, a higher place. The principles of the French Revolution had wide-range implications for other groups as well. Advocates for France's Jewish population seized on these principles in order to argue against forms of discrimination such as limitations on property ownership and restrictions on the trades that Jews were permitted to practice. In September 1791, the Legislative Assembly passed a decree granting full civic equality to Jews. In other parts of Europe, such as the German states, Jewish emancipation was a gradual process over the course of the 19th century, involving a series of edicts abolishing various particular discriminatory practices. But in France, the boldly categorical language of the Declaration of the Rights of Man inspired a more straightforward and dramatic approach. A single sentence in length, the decree announced that Jews were entitled to active citizenship on swearing a civic oath and renouncing the privileges and exceptions that had previously been granted to members of autonomous Jewish communities, such as separate taxes. This decree by no means meant the end of anti-Semitism in France, as would be shown, for example, by the ugly Dreyfus affair of the 1890s. Nonetheless, it established a legal framework for Jewish equality that remained intact from the Revolutionary era onward. Ironically, the revolutionary demand for universal equality also had the potential to undermine the rights of subordinate groups. The Les Chapelets Law of 1791, for example, banned guilds and trade unions in France, thus rendering it illegal for workers to organize in order to demand better treatment from their employers. The logic behind this law was identical to that of the Jewish Emancipation Decree, namely that any particular association involving only a single category of citizens reinforced the corporate charter of society, which had to be torn down in order to establish the new order. No competing allegiances must be permitted to interfere with the citizens' loyalty to the greater community of the nation. A bourgeois revolution? For many of the 20th century, a consensus persisted among historians that the French Revolution was a natural consequence of changing socio-economic conditions at the end of the old regime. Over the course of the 18th century, scholars have argued the French bourgeoisie was becoming steadily more prosperous and self-confident. Political power in the old regime, however, remained concentrated in the hands of the moribund monarchy and aristocracy. Thus, scholars interpreted the political events of 1789 to 1794 as a reflection of the bourgeoisie's effort to correct this imbalance by seizing political power commensurate with its newly established socio-economic preeminence. In recent decades, historical research has demonstrated that this social interpretation of the revolution is overly simplistic. Though a gradual expansion of commerce and industry occurred in France over the course of the 18th century, the majority of French economic production was agricultural even on the eve of the revolution. Most industry was centered in small shops run by craftsmen rather than in large factories. Not until 1785 did France receive its first steam engine. Unlike in England, where the Industrial Revolution was well underway by the late 18th century, industrialization in France began in earnest only during the first half of the 19th century, several decades after the Revolution. To the extent that a new capitalist class existed in pre-revolutionary France, it displayed little interest in radical political change. Many French entrepreneurs of this era were nobles, rather than bourgeois, and most prosperous members of the bourgeoisie were far more interested in joining the aristocracy by purchasing a title of nobility than in overthrowing the traditional social order. In the Estates General of 1789, few delegates of the Third Estate were merchants or industrialists. Instead, a large portion of them were lawyers and government functionaries who benefited from the economic order of the old regime. During the early stages of the Revolution, some of the most vociferous revolutionary leaders, Mirabeau, Talleyrand, Lafayette, Condorcet, among the others, were themselves aristocrats. Not only did French capitalists play a relatively limited role in leading the revolution, but it is also unclear whether they derived much immediate benefit from it. Indeed, some revisionist scholars have argued that the revolutionary events actually retarded France's economic development during the late 18th and early 19th centuries by reasserting the authority of traditional bourgeois social groups against the new entrepreneurial classes. Moreover, the Revolutionary Wars, along with the attendant military requisitions, inflicted heavy damage on certain sectors of the economy. France's Atlantic and Mediterranean ports, such as Marseilles, were devastated by the wars, and textile towns in the north and east, among them Lyons, also suffered heavily. In the words of Simon Schama, the bourgeoisie, which Marxist history long believed to be the essential beneficiaries of the revolution, was, in fact, its principal victim. Although this revisionist scholarship has convincingly refuted many conventional assumptions about the French Revolution, the events of 1789 to 1799 may still be considered a bourgeois revolution in a more limited sense. Some scholars have argued that, despite the absence of an industrial revolution in 18th century France, a growing consumer culture contributed to the rise of a democratic political sociability. This interpretation focuses on the transformation not of modes of production, but of patterns of consumption among the French middle classes. By 1789, writes Colin Jones, the nation was used to making choices. In the revolution, we might hypothesize, citizen voters were presented with a series of political consumer choices and were called on to evaluate the quality and the utility of the political commodities offered. Other historians have drawn a distinction between the revolution's causes and its consequences. They observe that the revolution, even though it was not led by the capitalist bourgeoisie, furthered the establishment of the egalitarian society and an industrialized economy in France. According to this view, the revolution was motivated primarily by political rather than by economic concerns. The revolutionaries' main goal was to establish a free and politically united nation, and they attacked the social fabric of the old regime as an essential step toward this end. Thus, the creation of a free market regime may be seen more as a byproduct of the revolutionaries' political aims than as the central goal of their program. This interpretation of the revolution's character is persuasive. It is difficult to assess the revolution's short-term impact on the French economy, primarily because it unleashed 23 years of nearly uninterrupted warfare from 1792 to 1815, which had complex and contradictory economic effects. But over the long run, by clearing away the tangled web of privileges and regulations that constituted the old regime, the revolution eliminated many of the impediments to France's industrialization. For example, in 1789, over 2,500 internal customs posts existed within France, all of which were abolished by the Revolution. Likewise, by selling off the lands of the Catholic Church, the revolutionaries increased the fluidity of land ownership, a useful factor in economic development. The abolition of trade guilds and the ban on labor associations made it easier for capitalists to start new enterprises and to control their workers. Finally, by eliminating titles of nobility, the revolution channeled the social ambitions of the populace into new directions. Rather than seeking to distinguish themselves by acquiring titles, citizens of France focused their energies increasingly on the acquisition of wealth. Thus, the desire for social distinction became a factor contributing to economic growth. Though the revolution had important effects on France's economic development, its cultural consequences were even more profound. To a great extent, the events of 1789 to 1799 provided a script that has inspired subsequent revolutionary movements around the world. It set the precedent for mobilizing the populace at large, both for political action and for waging war to a greater extent than ever before. Perhaps most important of all, it established rhetorical conventions for framing protests and demands for equality that could be utilized and modified by disenfranchised groups of every stripe: women, slaves, industrial workers, religious minorities, and the subjugated peoples of the colonial world. Over the past 2 centuries, around the world, various constituencies have drawn on this rhetoric in order to demand political and social rights. In this sense, it is hardly an exaggeration to say that all of modern history may be understood partly as an attempt to come to terms with the challenges of the French Revolution.